What are you looking for here?
Time. I need time to forgive myself. I need to escape. To forget what I did. I'm going. Are you staying or are you coming too?
No. This was the best month of my life. We're all prisoners of ourselves. And from that, there is no possible escape.
Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it is. It just is, especially as you arrive to the virtual Alexandria, to Aeon Byte. Run, rabbit, run. Dig that hole in the sun. And that clip is from the movie The Platform, the second one, a very Gnostic themed movie, a Spanish movie, but a very dark movie, so buyer beware. And your mileage may vary if you like these really intense, gory, but philosophical flicks. But we are getting into that time of the year as fall is upon us. My name is Miguel Connor, and as always, I am your Pompadour of Gnosis, that madman across the water. So glad to see everybody here on this Jupiter day if you're catching it live, and I hope everybody is doing well. Welcome to this age of Hermes, this Philip K. Dick world, and these Gnostic times, whereas we're all finding out nothing is as it seems, and that's just the way it is. And I'm very excited today to have our guest who offers an amazing rabbit hole to, again, give us another man behind the curtain. So many men behind the curtain. And so I welcome Michael Anthony Alberta on to discuss his book, Encrypted Reality, Interpreting History's Patterns. Michael, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Man, it's a real pleasure. This is a true milestone in my life. Let me tell you, Miguel, I didn't want to say all this before we spoke off camera, but I really wanted to kind of save this for the camera because your viewers, and I know a lot of you guys have been listening to Miguel for a decade, over a decade now. I think it's something like 15 years, I can imagine, so give or take.
Yeah.
Like me, I mean, the coffee, cigarette, and Gnosis days, and the intros. It's thank you, man. Thank you. I'm saying that for all of us, really. I mean, I'm sure you hear it in the comments, and people always email you. But honestly, my book is really a result of one of your main quotes, which is "Write your own gospel, live your own myth." Mm-hmm. Or someone else will do it for you. And I really took that to heart. And this book is a result of that. It's really so, yeah, guys. I mean, so anyway, thank you, Miguel. And as far as my book, yeah, man, it gets into a rabbit hole if I ever. It's constantly being updated. Even for me, it's so it's an organic structure at this point where, I mean, there is a version of the timeline that's essentially frozen in time on Amazon. It's under the title "The Renaissance Man: Portrait of a Spy Master," which I wrote a couple years back before large language models and AI started to explode. However, I used Wikipedia for that. So over like a decade, 5 years, give or take, period, I revisited Wikipedia pages like, for example, the history of math, the history of science, the history of the alphabet, so on and so forth. And I would superimpose that over different people's biographies and just studying history. It was really just a hobby because, I really wanted to write my own gospel and live my own myth. So, and I wanted to really understand this universe, especially from a Gnostic perspective. And when you do that, you develop a form of skepticism, especially in the historical narrative. And as a result, I started to question it. And as I was researching, I started to identify the patterns. And you see these patterns emerge almost like a fractal. And what happens is you get immersed in this timeline, and essentially it was a deciphering of my own lineage, because initially, like I said, it was a hobby. My 23andMe results, your podcast, a lot of stuff. I just had a plethora of information in my head, and I'm like, I should use this somehow. I need to articulate this to the world, because essentially I was talking to myself about it, and like we all know, I mean, philosophy and all these things are excellent. Gnosticism, but ultimately, it's important to enjoy your life, and sometimes you can overanalyze and really get bogged down in the weeds with some of this stuff. So I would revisit it back every so often, but then after a couple of years, a narrative emerged, and I started to get into the work of Anatoly Fomenko, who's a mathematician and an astronomer, and with Gleb Nosovsky and he had a whole team of people, of mathematicians, and so they put out a 20-book a series of, it's called The New Chronology, which it basically argues that world history was fabricated between the 11th and 17th century, but he pins it mainly on the 15th century with the development of the printing press. And also, but mainly he actually goes for the 17th century. I really focus on the 15th century during the Renaissance, Italy, and the Age of Exploration. But Fomenko also really pins it to Jesuits in the 18th century, like Dionysius Petavius and Joseph Justus Scaliger. These are some guys that he gets into. But ultimately, I believe that the main history that we now know, I mean, we know, for example, like Hermeticism, for example, that was really created. I mean, again, we could say, okay, Hermes Trismegistus, when Rome conquered Egypt, that's how we get this merging, possibly before. There's a lot of speculations, but hard evidence tells us that went down in the 15th century with Marsilio Ficino and Cosimo de' Medici. So a lot of the things that we associate with ancient is really and we're talking about within the actual historical narrative. I'm not even speculating. Like even Kabbalah, for example, Jewish mysticism, that goes back to Moshe Cordovero in the 13th century. And then you go to Isaac Luria in the 16th, and there's obviously layers, but it doesn't go to, I mean, yeah, they say it goes back to who is it, Rabbi Bar Yochai in the 2nd century or something. But that's very speculative, and there's no real tangible evidence from that. Some people obviously say, oh, Adam created.
Yeah, it was Adam. He got it. Adam and maybe, but not the real Adam. But wait, Michael, let me stop you there. Let me get Graham in. And Graham, how are you doing? Or like Africa, Bombada, and Johnny Rotten, you're in a time zone.
Oh, I sometimes I hate that question, how I'm doing. Today I'm doing pretty good. At least I'm nowhere in a country that's rioting too much.
So far. Yeah. Well, let's wait till tomorrow.
Exactly. Yeah, no. And interested in hearing from Michael. I'm always interested to hear from somebody else who's explored that rabbit warren behind the veil here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, for the audience, if you have any questions, please super chat them so we can get to them. I'm sure there's a lot you can ask Michael. So, Michael, let's get to the main event, your book. Let's get to your thesis, which basically says that history is not linear, but it's not a linear progression, but a, quote, as you say, master forgery. And as you said, it really solidified in the 15th century with the printing press and this network called the Watch. Tell us what's going on. What happened?
Yeah. Sure. So it was a mixture. There was a combination, all the recipes for a major score, so to speak. The 15th century, it wasn't just about the printing press. The printing press was obviously the main vehicle for the dissemination of the fabrication of history. However, there was also guns. All this happened within like 100-year period. And guns radically changed, warfare and everything. You present, there was cannons, the fall of Constantinople, and then, obviously the age of exploration, all that was a result of guns and projectiles. And then the nautical sail, where circumnavigation and things like that. So there was a series of events and let's not forget the Black Death. Europe was just coming out of that killed a huge amount of especially the literate population in densely populated cities. And then we took the Black Death to this neck of the woods. I'm here in Colombia. And are you in the States still, Miguel?
Yes, north of Chicago.
Chicago. And yeah, man, still over there. But yeah, actually, that's a Jersey accent. But my point is that Black Death wiped out a huge population and a huge amount of the human population. So all these things really allowed this supranational spy ring, which I call the watch. Mm-hmm. And the watch has a dual meaning. Number one, it's a watch, like in a timepiece, and those who surveil. So the watch, it weaves in and out of all kind of religions, organizations. So that's why I've labeled it it's that there's no real organization. There's people that say that could associate it with the Watchers, but no, this organization is basically a combination of a whole bunch of religion systems, because they weave in and out of different organizations and for societal control. Mm-hmm. So this watch essentially used this opportunity of plague and all these new technologies to disseminate a fabricated history. I think that history, in terms of like world history, for the most part, like the history that we know, generally speaking, is chronologically accurate. Mm-hmm. It's just compressed within a few 100-year period. So there's been histories that have been stretched out into antiquity and ancient times that really weren't ancient. They were these are results of changing calendars and doing things like that. So in ways you could see that, for example, in the age of exploration in the 15th century and 16th century, you see that same people from the same Southern European people, not necessarily the Greeks and because the Sea people were, after all, they were a whole bunch of people, but they were Southern Europeans from Greek in Sicily. And then obviously the age of exploration was the Spanish and the Portuguese, but it was still the same general vicinity, Southern Europeans. Right. And the only thing that really separated these two, when you look at the actual patterns, is guns. Even with the Sea peoples, it's very interesting because their actual attire, their whole wardrobe with the feathered hats and the armor and stuff like that, you see that same style perpetuated in Roman armor. You see that style in Vikings. So it's like all these seafaring people seem to look the same throughout thousands of years. So it's very difficult to square that circle. And then when you notice how a lot of the technologies that were transferred, for example, in the Bronze Age collapse with the Sea peoples, right before that happened, there was a Hyksos invasion of Egypt, and their exile was actually one of the precursors to the Bronze Age collapse. But my point is that foreign invasion mimics the same technologies that were brought into the Americas, like the wheel, horses. And it's odd because we're talking about thousands of years, So yes, so historians usually say, okay, this is they get into the Dark Ages and stuff like that. But no, I beg to differ. I don't think the Dark Ages, what are the Dark Ages? And how did we all of a sudden lose all that Greco-Roman knowledge and it just reappears in the 15th century, which brings us back to the watch. So what I think happened in the 15th century, especially during the fall of Constantinople, that flushed a whole bunch of Greek knowledge into Florence, Italy. Mm-hmm. And that's where we get the Neoplatonic Academy. That's where people like Marsilio Ficino and Hermeticism and all these fabricated doctrines that you see, you start to say, wait a minute, what's real and what's fake, and how do we really vet this? Because supposedly you know, a lot of these things, like even Socrates and Plato, and we're talking about people that rewrote these things in the 15th century. So when you think about that, and obviously the printing press made us literate, and that gets into the whole idea of behavioral modernity, because we have to ask ourselves, okay, Mike, if our history goes back only to the 11th century, what in the world were we doing before that? And I speculate that we were in what a professor or philosopher, a late philosopher named Julian Jaynes, he's like from the 70s and 80s, but he came up with this book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And I think, I'm not sure if you've ever explored this, Miguel.
I have, yeah.
I think, yeah, because it's right up your alley. This whole thing gets really into the idea of gnosis. Right. And the whole idea of behavioral modernity, because when he saw that prior to the Bronze Age collapse, all the texts, for example, the Iliad, there's no introspection. There's no it's all the characters in the book is only taking orders from gods, and we see that obviously before that in Egypt, in Babylon. It just seems like no one's really philosophizing or really having a understanding of the self. It seems like it's always like almost like a schizophrenic where they're talking to themselves.
Right,
it's a god, you know. And I think it sounds funny, but I really think that we were actually, I don't think all of us were. That's why there's this watch. These were people that actually got out of that bicameral mentality and were able to wield it and essentially manipulate the people that were still in. And don't get me wrong, like even to this day, consciousness is we're on a spectrum. There are people still fundamentally bicameral today. And that's what I love so much about your podcast, is because you expose this hidden like bullshit world, you know what I mean? And it's like, you actually see, that's how you get out of bicamerality. When you take the gods as a joke and you realize that these are figments of our imagination, you know, I'm not saying there's probably an omnipresent, creator. I'm not, that's obviously, even that, until I actually see evidence, it's very difficult for me to co-sign anything. But obviously my research leads me to that belief, but that's neither here nor there. Mm-hmm. The point is that we still have vestiges of this bicamerality inside of our minds now when it comes to religion and different ideologies like political systems and stuff like that, where we get gripped basically by a leader, like the dictators. These people are able to tell us what to do, and what happens is when we allow ourselves to basically get manipulated by forces that are preaching. When you say with religions, a lot of these religions are essentially land deeds when you really look at it, and we're co-signing people's divine right to rule that essentially are very rarely even indigenous to the land that so it gets into a whole idea of psychological operations and really like the Hegelian dialectic. Mm-hmm. And I reterm it as what I call narrative recapture. And this is a tool that this watch uses. This is how this is one of the reasons why they fabricated the history, because it essentially co-opts people into, it's like the idea of the reconciled combatant. I've gotten to this into previous podcasts, but I'll basically glaze the surface. Is what it does is a good analogy would be how when the Christians came into Israel, they were polytheists, but they left monotheists worshiping the God of Israel through the Son Jesus Christ. These are like, ultimately you have to ask yourself, how is this possible? And I get into who actually set the stage for these fabrications, which goes back to the Vatican, but a specific individual named Leon Alberti.
Well, Michael, before I want to get to B or Batista, yeah, like you said, The bicameral mind, I'm thinking I'm going to quote Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon again. There's someone in my head, but it's not me. And of course, yeah, your work reminds me of what Mark Twain said: history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, and you show how it rhymes, like pandemics. You have this pandemic that keeps, it's the same pandemic in different cities that gets reported. But so the audience knows, before we get to Batista, so basically this the watch, again, this network of power brokers, they basically extended history. Is that what they did? And what is fabricated exactly? What are the same things that are fabricated?
Well, yes, in most cases, I don't necessarily think a lot of the history was fabricated. What I do think is there are timelines that are basically stretched out.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure there are things fabricated. We see that coming up all the time.
All the time.
And we associate things with being ancient that weren't. And I'm sure there's a lot more to be explored, because carbon dating, I don't necessarily I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I believe in like dendrochronology and tree ring dating, like a lot of these sciences. This is how we collectively vet information. But even on that, using that logic, you still see the problems in the timelines. So, did I answer your question though, Miguel?
Yeah, like some examples. What would you say is or overlaps? What are some timelines that you would say are overlap that we've been told don't overlap?
Right. So, for example, if you look at, I've never gotten into this in another podcast because I've mentioned a lot of other instances in other podcasts. But for example, this one I've never got into, which would be the Khazar Khaganate, which are essentially Tengris from Ukraine. They're proto-Mongols. Like when we think of who the Mongols were, you see these same, we say, okay, Mongolia, Siberia, but the Kushan Empire, you see these are the progenitors of the Kushan Empire. Now, the Kushan Empire, they're the result of Alexander the Great's conquest in Pakistan. So, and you can tag Alexander the Great to those same Hyksos that I was telling you about, because they're supposedly they come from the Daneans, the Macedonian king. Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father. So my point being is they're basically the same people that are it's like there's been one culture coming in and basically changing history as they go. And you see, like, this is what the mainstream historical narrative tells us, because wherever this culture goes, they call it Rome, call it what you want, you see that there's degradation when they leave, and wherever they go afterwards, all of a sudden there's a civilization. So, okay, another a really good example of how the history is like through plagues. You can see a lot of the plagues, they describe very, very similar events.
All right.
But the main way that you could really see this, Miguel, is through the alphabet. The alphabet is, so for example, the main alphabet that it comes from with writing, obviously we get the Sumerians. The Sumerians they did cuneiform. We can't even really call that writing. Real writing, actual words and stuff, is really Akkadian. That's where the bulk of the cuneiform comes from. So a perfect example with the Akkadians and the Sumerians. Etana, which is one of the first king to rule after the deluge, the flood, and that gets into the flood is that's one of those things that are perpetuated. But for example, the Sumerians talk about the eagle and serpent. Okay, that's what laid the foundation, was an eagle concerning a serpent on a tree.
Yeah.
Now that whole thing is echoed thousands of years later with the Aztecs and the serpent and the eagle. And the,
you have to say it right. Our Mexican friends would say they weren't Aztecs, they were Mexicas.
Right. Well,
the Aztecs were the Confederacy. Anyway, I know I'm being pedantic.
It's good that you got into that, because that brings us up to that RG character that we mentioned earlier, Leon Alberti.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of instances where
there's this
where
rhyme. There's too many parallels to ignore.
And it's not, you don't really want to pay attention to the lyrics, so to speak, but the beat. You can hear, if you listen to the beat, you see, the way I could best describe it's like scratching paint from a painting and noticing there's another painting beneath it. You know what I mean? Like you're taking off the first layer, or you're realizing that when you just scratch that painting, maybe it was a different color prior to that scratch. So anyway, what I notice with the patterns is I say to myself, okay, what is this? Is this because Carl Jung talks about archetypes and perpetual patterns, and I say, okay, maybe history wasn't fabricated, and we're just in this Jungian archetypal collective unconscious.
It just comes out. Yeah.
So, and I'm like, okay. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe Carl Jung studying history noticed it could be a little bit of both. That's most likely, because when you go to either extreme, it gets into fantasy land.
Right. I agree.
But I also think that this watch uses these archetypes to actually embed their timelines. Because when you can control the past, you can control the future. When you control the future, you control the past. So that's their whole thing. Even with, when you look at different wars throughout history, right after we started recording video and recording sound, that's when the First World War came. And World War II is right after video. World War I shortly after sound. So I really believe that once we're able to capture history, that's where, in different ways, that's where this watch really capitalizes on the remixing of world history.
They control the media, the advanced media of the time. You control that. You can control reality.
Yeah, exactly. And we see this playing out today with fake news. Like, who's to say that hasn't been going on for thousands of years?
It has.
And I actually get into this because I get into this even on a personal level, because that's another book I wrote called The Living Code, where I actually help people decipher their own histories, because it turns out 90% of the histories that we tell ourselves about our own lives is completely fucking fabricated.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get lost in a lot of, studying world history, and it's fun. I mean, obviously everyone needs an out, and honestly, Gnosticism, things like this is one of the best things you could do for yourself and for your own personal growth. However, it's also important to study ourselves and look at our patterns, look at what are the things that we are repeating that are need to be identified.
We are fake history. We are programmed beings,
right?
No better than.
We're pattern recognition machines,
right?
And that's really what I'm trying to do with the readers and even your viewers, is notice the patterns when you're reading history, or when you're studying history. Ask yourself, can you take that chunk of history that you're studying and put it backwards in time, a few thousand, few hundred years, or possibly put it forwards in time, depending on obviously what part of history you're studying. And try to see, okay, maybe there's some patterns there. Maybe, is it possible that, during the 15th century with the printing, because mind you, before the printing press, most of the world wasn't literate. And Julian Jaynes specifically ties behavioral modernity, breaking out of that bicameral consciousness, to literacy. So no matter which way, and the thing about Julian Jaynes' research, it hasn't been able to be debunked. Like, if you look through all Bronze Age, pre-Bronze Age collapse literature, there is no introspection. There's no, I even was using artificial intelligence to ask me, but everyone he's talking to the gods, everyone's taking orders from, if not it's the gods, it's the priest class. And this priest class, these intermediaries, so to speak, this is the watch. And the watch, I think essentially we're humanists. This is because humanism is like the the opposite of bicamerality. You know,
Mhm.
that's real introspection. You're really drilling deep into oneself. So what I think happened is like that's why a lot of history that we know is Greco-Roman history. And when you think about historical empires, or there's no other empire, whether it's the Persians or the Imperial Chinese, call it who, the Roman Empire has left the biggest imprint in the world. You know, if you were an alien looking at us, that I would assume you would probably, but you know, and then there's no accident. Like with the archons, you know, the original word for the archons were Greco-Roman rulers, basically magistrates.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's something there, man. I think that these guys in the 15th century, they, you know, when Spain and Portugal, they basically divided the world, and that disseminated a huge omni-myth. So that's why we also see a huge Indo-European imprint perpetually throughout history. Because when you really start studying history, I got into this in previous podcast, you see that there's this, you know, Indo-Europeans from, you know, the Black Sea, Caspian Sea region, essentially coming down on horseback through metallurgy. And, you know, for example, the Vinca culture, the same people responsible for smelting copper, which was the first metal to be smelted. You know, then we got, you know, bronze from the Bronze Age and all that. We got that from allegedly Britain, from my newest research. But the point being is this same Vinca culture with the metallurgy, that's where we get the first proto-writing from. And there's a lot of new research that's showing that Vinca script relates to Sumerian. It's basically Proto-Sumerian. So there's a lot of correspondences with the Indo-Europeans, and you know, the idea that the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Italians, all these guys got together during this time. And that's why I think a lot of the Greco-Roman history was stretched out. I think there's a lot of history that genuinely only really does go back to the 10th century. And like in reality, there were a lot of cultures in the world that were in the Stone Age in the 10th century. I just argue everybody was, but it's not like and there was definitely, like even Julian Jaynes says, in the 15th century, when the conquistadors came in contact with like the Inca and the Aztec, that was like two modes of consciousness colliding, you know, the bicameral and what the problem with consciousness is, that's why Montezuma and these guys, they did not recognize the deceit, because when you're not conscious and you're in a bicameral state of mind, you're not capable of deception. It's like a gift. Consciousness is a gift and a curse, you know? So yeah, man, I also wanted to get into the simulation, because I noticed you titled this talk,
it's always a simulation. But first, tell us who
sure.
I guess the architect, if you would, just quickly, Leon Battista Alberti. I mean,
I'll do it quickly.
He's not like Emperor Palpatine, some guy, you know, evil guy. He's just another geek.
He kind of, you know, he's all right in my book. He got himself wrapped up with, I mean, I actually argue Leon Battista Alberti is a cipher. It's not actually his name. The individual was actually born Nezahualcóyotl and he was an Aztec, essentially a Toltec. And Toltecs, they are, you know, they're from the cult of Quetzalcoatl. Their lineage comes from Quetzalcoatl, and Quetzalcoatl is not necessarily a mythical character. According to their history, there was an actual person named Quetzalcoatl that he was a foreigner, you know, and there's speculation of him being bearded with an aquiline nose. So there's a lot of directions.
Kenny Loggins visited them and then left.
The thing about it is there was Vikings in Greenland at the same time that this Quetzalcoatl character emerged. And this is the same time swastikas start popping up in Native American, you know. So, you know, that there are some patterns that I've identified that, yes, I would say that Quetzalcoatl is most likely, I don't know if he was a Norman Viking, but he was definitely a seafaring individual. And what happened is that Nezahualcóyotl, I mean, his mother was an indigenous, you know, from my research, but his father was a direct descendant of this Quetzalcoatl. So the point being is his father was murdered in front of him by the actual Mexico. And after that happened, he fled to Peru. Now that's why people in Peru, they worship who? Viracocha. Viracocha is basically a rebranded Quetzalcoatl, the same mythic figure, Sky Father. You know, they don't necessarily call him a feathered serpent, but he's a bearded white god, basically. And it's interesting with Aztec and Toltec, it's a place of whiteness. I don't really want to get into that whole spiel, which I have on other podcasts. But that also ties into the whole Indo-European presence in history being fabricated in the 15th century, blah, blah, blah. As far as Leon Battista Alberti, though, so when his father got murdered in front of him as Quetzalcoatl, and his father's name is Itzcoatl. I know I'm trying to pronounce the name. But the point is that he went to Peru, and that's where you get the Inca Empire. A lot of people think that the Aztec and Inca is some ancient. But when you actually dig into the actual history, it doesn't go much further back than the early 15th century. So he rebrands himself after his father as Pachacuti, uses this Viracocha myth to have a divine right. He obviously uses, because you also see a transfer of technologies during that, like, it was like 15. And what's interesting, the same, Quetzalcoatl was 15 years old when his father was murdered. That's, by the way, Leon Battista Alberti has the same birth date and death date as Quetzalcoatl and the ruler of the Inca, which is Pachacuti. So all three of these guys, they all share the same birth date and death date, and they all basically practice. These are all like polymaths, and they're all into cryptography. Leon Battista Alberta, the father of cryptography. Pachacuti, who's he called himself Pachacuti when he went to the Andean Peruvian. And what happened was, when you look at the name Pachacuti, that means he who overturns space and time, or it's actually Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. That's the full name. If you just say Pachacuti by itself, it means cataclysm. And it's interesting because he wasn't even called this name until after Pachacuti left. The locals called him that because all of a sudden plagues came, the conquistadors came. It was a literal friggin' cataclysm for them. But they revere Pachacuti even to this day. Pachacuti's revered. He's not some kind of villain, and I don't even think he was a villain, because this brings me to my next point, is that when he then basically Pachacuti went back to Mexico. That's where the Inca Empire started. Then he went to Mexico, started the Aztec Empire to avenge his father. And Quetzalcoatl to this day too is also revered in Mexico. He's on the $100 bill, a peso rather. Point being, that's where I think we get humanism from this cult of Quetzalcoatl, because I don't think history goes back too much to the 10th century when this figure emerged. And when you think about humanism and the art, because that's essentially what Toltec means. The word actually means he who brings civilization, but it also means artisan, because they were painters and sculptors, and these guys would have fit right into the. So what happens is, I think that once he formed the Aztec and Inca Empire, because his father, these Toltecs were part of the watch. I speculate, I'm not sure all Toltecs, but I have a sneaking suspicion Quetzalcoatl, because he brought all these kind of new technologies to the land. He wasn't from there. And this is what I think happens is spies basically subvert cultures from within. And eventually they get exiled. This is a perpetual pattern we see. And so, for example, when Cortez landed on the shores, he used the whole Quetzalcoatl myth, because what happened was Quetzalcoatl, when he came back to Peru, he had his father's bodyguard gather up all the books and burn everything. And they actually rewrote the whole history based on this Quetzalcoatl myth. So that was priming them for an arrival of some kind of subvert, like one of Quetzalcoatl's family members would pass judgment. So people, when they see Cortez in this shiny suit and this metal and all these things that are basically describing what's going to happen. And it's interesting because their calendars, they were basically waiting for this event to happen with these calendars. And it's funny because the calendars oddly match up to European dates. And more importantly, it matches up to the Fibonacci sequence, which is it's very difficult to even articulate that now. So I don't understand. I mean, granted, this is a pattern in nature. And yes, for all intent and purposes, it's possible. So, because I believe Leonardo Fibonacci found it by observing rabbit populations. But you can see it in tree growth and galaxies. There's a lot of ways this pattern has popped up. And that's why it could relate to calendars, because it actually has something to do with the way we perceive time. But not even that. Just like, for example, their creation, the creation of their world ties into the biblical creation, like, what is it, like 5,000 something BC? There was a lot of dates that matched European things. And I get into that in detail in my book. So, yeah, this Quetzalcoatl character.
This is B, the architect, Renaissance man, mathematician, polymath, and all that. So he's basically the one who sets the stage. Well, before we, oh my God, over here I'm throwing things around. Before we get into the simulation, because of course I want to hear your ideas. I was going to say history in my title, but I'm like, I'm going to say simulation because it's
Cool.
Let me bring in Graham. Graham, what do you think? Making sense to you, or do you have questions for Mr. Michael?
Call me out, Graham.
I was going to say a lot of it makes sense to me. A lot of it is sort of you go to places I just can't follow. Nothing wrong with that. I go to plenty of places out there. The one that jumped out to me first that seems obvious, the name The Watch. Did you intentionally choose that from the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, or is that just one of those happy synchronicities?
No, I did. Because, for example,
the Watchers are the egregore. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. The Watchers, so if you look at who are the Watchers, they get into the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the Anunnaki. But if you actually look at who these historical figures are, they're the Amorites. Now, the Amorites are responsible for all kind of, these are essentially indigenous Canaanites. That's what the Amorites. And mind you, Canaan wasn't just modern day Israel, Palestine. It was part of Jordan. It's part of all the whole surrounding area. Even up until Turkey, Canaan, a lot of people don't realize that. But the point being is these Amorites are responsible for the first alphabets. So these are the Watchers, so to speak. If you were to go on a Wikipedia or ChatGPT or something and ask yourself, were the Amorites the Watchers, or how does the Amorite? You'll see what I'm talking about. The point being is these Amorites, these people talk about a hyper-diffusism, because the Hyksos, which brings us back to where I was talking about, that introduced all this new technology. They brought the wheel into Egypt and crossbows and horses. My point is that these Amorites, they were Amorites. This is where we get the first alphabet. This is where we get agriculture from, because the Canaanites, the indigenous Canaanites, are essentially Natufians. But sticking to the Amorites, because when these Amorites relate to the fundamental of Chinese civilization through the Yellow Emperor. The Yellow Emperor was an Amorite. Even the current Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sun Weidong, says yes, Chinese civilization was 5,000 years ago, was initially brought by, it was Egyptian ores, Egyptian technology, but it was Egyptian during a foreign invasion, which was of these Amorites. These Amorites, because not only did they control Egypt at the time, they controlled Babylon. And when you look at the two oldest, like I said, these guys invented the alphabet. Also, when you look at the two oldest mathematical texts in the world, which is the Egyptian Rhine papyrus and the Plimpton 122 from Babylon. Mm-hmm. Both of these texts come from Amorite rule. This is where you first get the first mentions of the Fibonacci sequence. In terms of the Rhine papyrus, this is where you get pyramid building. So I think like a lot of people associate the pyramids with Khafre or a bunch of other. This came from these Amorites, because these were the Egyptians prior to that foreign invasion have no there's no record. There's nothing related to the Fibonacci sequence or the phi ratio, and we know the Great Pyramid of Giza lines up to the phi ratio. And it's interesting because this phi ratio pops up everywhere, even in double entry bookkeeping with the Medici banking family. So it ties into so much. Even what we think is aesthetically pleasing is related to this Fibonacci sequence. I'm conflating these terms. I don't want to confuse you. The Fibonacci, because we can't really articulate the phi ratio mathematically, because it basically goes on forever. But the Fibonacci sequence, we could get our heads around better. So it's basically one and the same thing. But anyway, before I get lost in the cause.
No, I understand the relationship. Oh, go ahead.
Yes, the Amorites. So these guys are, this same people are responsible not only for Chinese civilization, but also the earliest form of Sanskrit. You get into the Mitanni, the earliest form of Sanskrit and the Vedas and stuff like that. That comes from Syria, which was also Canaan, ancient Canaan. This was from these Amorites. It's a proven fact. If you look at who spoke Sanskrit first, where did Sanskrit come from? A lot of us associate that with India or something like that. Right. But no, it was these Amorites. And this is what brings me to the points, because they were called Amorites in the Levant. Now, what's west of the Levant? The Greco-Roman world. Right. So what I'm trying, all roads kind of lead to Rome in a certain extent. I'm not necessarily saying, I do think that they were Canaanites, but they were that whole Mediterranean soup. There's definitely something there. Now, yeah, also with the Amorites, like I said, the Indian culture, they rebranded themselves later on as the Arameans, the Amorites. So it's like basically the relationship of the Vikings to the Normans. You can associate that with the Amorites and the Arameans. Now, Abraham, Rachel, all the main patriarchs and matriarchs in early Judaism were Arameans. So, and then you look at, okay, the alphabet. The Aramaic script is basically the father of most, it's really the Proto-Canaanite. The Amorite alphabet is the great granddaddy. But if you really look at where most languages actually borrowed from, it was from that Aramaic script. That was the allegedly the language that Jesus spoke. There's just so many correlations. I could kind of, when you get into the
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying, and I agree that you're on to definitely. You're deep in the rabbit hole here. You're definitely, rooting around in the tunnels pretty good. Where I have some trouble with, and this goes back to the, your ideas in Quetzalcoatl, is you're seeing some patterns, and you're tying it to a single individual or culture, when it's like, your Renaissance guy with the printing press G. It's like he pretty much lived an entire life in Europe. And same thing with Pachacooty and Quetzalcoatl, where you have the story of, Quetzalcoatl's reign, and then he goes back to the coast and, either dies or returns back to the east. And you have the same thing with Viracocha, where it's the story about how he goes down to the ocean and then basically walks across the water and disappears. Right. And, I'm just saying it's one of those where I agree with you. I see definite patterns between all of these people and all of those. I can't, it's the leap to that there was one single living individual who seems to have lived way, way too long. And, born, got old, died. Born, got old, died. And if you're going with more of a reincarnation sort of concept, that I might find a little easier to go with. But you're basically saying it's actually the same individual. And I'm just sharing you where I have trouble going,
Well, no, before you go to, because this is my point with the watch, is they basically have an archetypal Renaissance man, which is essentially the spy master. So every generation, it's like a reincarnated Dionysian Jesus Christ type of figure, that reemerges as a rebirth of the agency. So the agency is, because I argue that the agency was compromised after G's death. So point being is they're following from the 11th century to the. I argue that G was basically three figures, and those three figures was Nezahualcóyotl, Leon Battista Alberti, and Pachacuti. And my argument for that is a few. Number one, Leon Battista Alberti. When you said he spent his whole life in Europe, there's no real record of him in Europe until 1428. And he actually, his original name, it's a proven fact that his name was not Leon Battista Alberti. He just showed up on the scene. It was some other name. And, it's very odd. His father died the same time as Nezahualcóyotl's father died. Also, Pachacuti, he was the only one doing cryptography in this entire hemisphere. This is the thing. When you look at Quipu, he was the only one doing cryptography, and then Alberti was the one that invented the polyalphabetic cipher. Now, what really ties these guys together, Graham, and this is what helped, because yes, it's difficult to kind of be like, how is this one individual? No, it's not just one individual. He was funded by the Medici family. There was a whole network of people he got with because he left Peru to go to Italy. When he went to Italy, for example, Toscanelli, who gave the map to Columbus, he studied under Alberti. This is a historical fact. This is not speculation. And also on the Vespucci end, Lorenzo di Medici gave Vespucci the coordinates, which, Amerigo Vespucci, that's where we get the name America from. And Lorenzo di Medici studied under Alberti too. This was like, he was a main.
Oh, absolutely. There was a secret organization that had knowledge of the Americas, and probably occasionally traveled back and forth. But as a lot of people have put out, have explored, there wasn't a lot of between interocean transmission. You see, like potato. You see that it can happen, but you don't.
And stuff, right?
Yeah, you see, like potatoes in Polynesia and South America and such. You never saw that sort of transmission where crops that would have been easily grown in Europe came back. Well, and that could have been intentional and everything. But I'm just saying, I agree with you that there was this organization that kept it secret and all. Again, you're into Knight Templar area and stuff there. So
no, I mean, listen, I'm always open to new ideas, and so when I think that a lot of that's deliberate obfuscation of knowledge. So yeah, you got to ask yourself, why wasn't the wheel ever introduced into the Americas? Or how is it that metal smelting all of a sudden just appeared? Like bronze metal smelting suddenly appears in the Inca Empire at its high altitude. Like usually there's a gradual, like we said, it goes from copper to, and all of a sudden these guys know exactly what to bring to the top of the mountain to make bronze, But the point is that, yeah, man, when we get into Alberti and Nezahualcóyotl, to really help you understand that, Graham, is the Voynich manuscript. Now, I'm not sure if to lay the basis of this Voynich manuscript, people have been trying to decipher this manuscript for hundreds of years now.
Yeah, really.
And it's always, right now it's in Yale. It's that's where you get the skull and bones, and that's where the CIA is originally. So there's like a lot of intel. Before that, it was involved with all kind of kings, and we get into Athanasius Kircher, who was a Jesuit who studied Hermeticity. This gets into a whole thing, and I get into like the line. So basically, and I'll get into that. Before I fast forward, let me go to the very beginning. So with the Voynich manuscript, they say it was actually printed and produced in Florence, Italy, in the 15th century through carbon dating and all kinds of things like that. However, the paint, the atacamite and the paint in different plants that are drawn in this manuscript are Mesoamerican and Andean American plants. Mm-hmm. Also, the actual script, they know there's an alphabet. They know these are actual words. They just don't know what kind of words these are. But it resembles Nahuatl, which is Nezahualcóyotl's native language. But it also relates to Roman numerals. It's some kind of few, and it just so happens that would have been Alberti's main cryptography. That's when he created the polyalphabetic cipher, he used the Roman. So, and then when you look at Pachacuti, like I said, the only form of cryptography in the Americas was by this Pachacuti character, who is also a descendant of Viracocha, who's the Quetzal. You know, there's a lot of things that then you're like, how these guys were born and died at the same time. You know, that's a little convenient. So anyway, this Voynich manuscript, after Alberti wrote it, you know, there's a lot of speculation that Roger Bacon did it or John Dee did it, but all these hermetic occult figures throughout time, you know, that's a rabbit hole and a half, just the Voynich manuscript. But I really believe that I found the author. So hopefully one of your people will listen to this and at least, because I'm not saying I deciphered it, but I think whoever manages to decipher it, because for example, it was in Bletchley Park with Alan Turing. That's where we get the Five Eyes organization from. You know, Alan Turing, I think, cracked it. I think people are able to crack it. I think Kircher, Francis Bacon, there have been people, and that I believe this whole watch is based on cryptography. That's why I get into the alphabet, because the alphabet is essentially cryptography. And like I said, most of the world was not literate prior to the 15th century, which is a proven fact. So whoever really was able to read and write, that was a primitive form of cryptography for all intent and purpose. The elite, the priest class, these were the only people that were really had these facilities. And this ties into bicameral mentality, man, and the idea of, you know, they were building monoliths and all kind of statues that would possess people in awe and inspire their rulership, essentially. You know, that they would craft these myths that would allow them to usurp control over less conscious people that weren't exposed to. Like I said, we're on a scale, so depending on what, you know, a culture has been through collectively, I believe that is what a lot of it involves shock, a lot of it involves knowledge, but this is how we get conscious, you know. So yeah, as far as Julian Jaynes, though, because I really want to focus on him more. Oh no, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get into the simulation.
Let's do it.
So if we consider the bicameral mind in the context of a simulation, it adds an interesting layer. In a simulated reality, the voices of the bicameral mind could be interpreted as direct inputs or programming from the creators of the simulation. The commands heard by bicameral individuals wouldn't be divine, but rather direct instructions from the underlying code or operators of their simulated world. This would reinforce the idea that their actions are not truly their own, but rather pre-programmed responses within the simulation. As the bicameral mind breaks down and individuals develop self-awareness, it could be seen as a glitch or an emergent property within the simulation, allowing the simulated beings to gain a degree of free will and diverge from their original programming. While this analysis has frequently employed the metaphor of a designer in a holographic universe to illustrate the pervasive influence of the watch and its agent templates, these concepts are presented not as a literal assertions or a reality being a computational simulation governed by Alberti's consciousness. Because I also get into, like, when we get into Five Eyes and we get into like the surveillance state, we can actually trace the modern day computers. Like, for example, a proto-computer is an Enigma machine. An Enigma machine is an electric polyalphabetic cipher. The polyalphabetic cipher was invented by Alberti. That's how he became the father of European cryptography. So there's a line, even with optics, even like when we look at cameras and stuff, because his logo was an eye in the sky. Like we think of like the eye in the pyramid and all these. That actually comes from 15th century Vatican. But that 15th, because Alberti was the main. He designed all the aqueducts, and like his main patrons was like the Pope Nicholas V, Pius II. These were his main. So he was tied into all these people. But my point is, with his logo, that same logo is used by DARPA. DARPA is where we get the internet from. You know, the eye with the So there's so many things that tie into Alberti when it comes to surveillance. Because like when you think of like a winged eye, you know, that's like an eye in the sky, a drone or a satellite. You know what I mean? So that's how I kind of tie this into the simulation, which I got into in previous paragraphs before I wrote this, but I just figured I'd preface that because, anyway, the increasing reliance on technology. Okay, excuse me.
Yeah, keep talking. I have to let the cat out, but I'm listening.
Okay. Now, a reality computation is governed by Alberti's consciousness. I don't think that we're in a reality covered by his consciousness, because I had to make that clear, because there's a, it kind of goes off the deep end when I get into, the drones and this and that, obviously. But the point being is, rather they serve as a powerful allegories to highlight the profound, often hidden forces that have shaped our past and continue to influence our present. This perspective does not, however, rule out the possibilities that reality itself might operate on principles akin to a simulation of sorts, where underlying mathematical constants like pi and phi govern natural and historical patterns. The increasing reliance on technology to perform tasks and make decisions for us could be seen as modern-day echo, albeit a metaphorical one, of the bicameral mind. When algorithms dictate what we see online, smart systems manage our homes, and AI assists in complex decision-making, we might gradually cede aspects of our conscious deliberation and free will to external technological voices. If technology advances to the point where it anticipates our needs and desires so perfectly that we rarely have to make a conscious choice, it could lead to a passive state where our actions are effectively guided by an external intelligence, much like the bicameral man was guided by gods. This doesn't suggest a literal return to auditory hallucinations, but rather a subtle, pervasive influence that minimizes the need for consciousness, self-directed action, potentially impacting the very exercise of our individual agency and the felt experience of free will. The bicameral mind faded with the rise of self-aware consciousness, yet traces remain in creativity, childhood imaginary companions, and dreams. Even today, stress or altered states can trigger these vestigial processes, reframing mental illness and spirituality as evolutionary echoes rather than purely psychological or supernatural. Consciousness, the inner I, varies by culture and individual. Some think in words, others images or habits. James argues it's shaped by language and societal narratives, with children, hallucinations, and oral cultures revealing how fragile our self-narrative can be. We live in a universe, almost done, guys. Here we go. We live in a universe, or indeed a reality, that behaves in predictable pattern ways, inviting deeper inquiry into fundamental nature. This thought then transcends the realm of mere historical reevaluation. It is conceived as a diagnostic tool for humanity's collective psyche. It is, in essence, a mechanism of self-diagnosis. Understanding this historical cryptogram, this meticulously crafted, continuously scrambled narrative, serves as a diagnostic instrument by enabling humanity to identify the reoccurring patterns, the phantom paths, and the agent templates that are intricately woven into our fabric of reality. It allows the discerning of the deliberate manipulation concealed behind seemingly organic historical progression, thereby revealing the hidden structures in the invisible architects who orchestrate the trajectory of human civilization. The specific illnesses this diagnosed process identifies in humanity include a pervasive enforced forgetfulness that condemns us to perpetually repeat past patterns due to obscured historical lessons, a susceptibility to continuous manipulation through reverse psychology and controlled opposition, the pervasive illusion of free will operating within a predetermined global social order, the surfacing of unresolved primal instincts and aggressive potentials from our collective shadow, which I didn't get into in this episode, but maybe some other time. But we can get into, the whole idea of what I call the legacy reflex, because I believe this watch functions off of a primitive grudge match that it involves archaic admixture of extinct hominids. But let me finish this simulation thing, because I know your viewers will really get a kick.
Sure, go ahead.
So if, as posited, our reality is indeed a holographic projection meticulously curated by a guiding force through the watch, then the ultimate act of advancing is not merely comprehending the historical cryptogram, but recognizing the very nature of the simulation itself. If we are truly living in a simulation, then the existence of a singular monotheistic God becomes not plausible, but logically elegant. Every simulation has a programmer, an ultimate architect who designs its rules. Now, we could also look at that, as a demiurge, depending on. So initiates its starting initiates its starting conditions and sustains its reality. In this view, the Lord is not a distant, abstract idea, but the conscious mind behind the code, the one who authored the physical constraints and the moral framework we experience. Just as a simulation cannot exist without a singular source of computation, our reality cannot exist without a singular creator. One intelligence powerful enough to generate, sustain, and if desired, rewrite the entire fabric of existence.
Well, beautiful.
yes,
Love
gentlemen.
it. Love it. It makes perfect sense. Yeah. We are probably should wrap it up soon. For those of you, if you have a super chat or a question, this is your time. I'm sure you have questions. Of course, you can check out Michael's book. He's got his website there, Michael Anthony Alberta.com. But I wanted to ask real quickly, so does your work overlap with flamenco and Tartaria, or you disagree or
Yes.
break? I'm sure there's
There's
parallels
obvious
and disagreements. Yeah.
Absolutely. However, yes, for generally speaking, like because that's originally how I started, really getting into Alberti was through flamenco, because flamenco relates Alberti to Vitruvius. He basically says that's a phantom reflection of Vitruvius. Vitruvius is a first century polymath architect. That's where we get the Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man from. So when we think of that whole thing was based on treaties written by Alberti, Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. And that's a historical fact. But yeah, that what was your question, Miguel? I'm sorry.
Just your work certainly overlaps with flamenco.
Yes,
what
it
about
definitely.
the Tartaria?
Right. With Tartaria, yes. I mean, originally I was a little taken aback by Tartaria, but when I really started prying into it more, I started saying, okay, yes, the Tartarians relate more to the Malta Barrette culture, which that'll kind of get us into a whole thing. But in general, they're a Siberian hunter-gatherers from 30,000 BC to about 15,000 BC. And they were like the last people to carry on the Neanderthal way of life. We see that through like the Venus figurines and things like that. Now, these Malta Barrette, who were essentially, they were Central Asians, Siberians, for lack of a better term, Mongolians. They are also the progenitors of the Native Americans. These are the same exact culture that actually crossed the Bering Strait. And it's interesting because these people also shacked up with the Natufians, which I brought up earlier, which were from, Canaan. And then they went to Turkey. That's where the Göbekli Tepe comes from. Now, those Malta Barrette came in contact with those Natufians, and that's where we get the Indo-Europeans. So this Malta Barrette, and this is an actual, your viewers should look this up because it's kind of interesting. This one culture, they are the progenitors of both Native Americans and Indo-Europeans. So those are, I believe, the Tartarians. And yes, flamenco's work. We agree on many things. We also, like, for example, with everything obviously comes back to Russia. I have my own biases. Like we all have naturally when you study history. Like I said, this was a real decipherment of my own lineage to a certain extent and just understanding history from my own perspective. But while doing that and while writing, because like I said, this book is 5-10 years in the making, I had to call myself out on my own biases and realize, like, sometimes we want narratives to kind of fit our, and the truth can hurt sometimes. And it's not always comfortable. So I try to stay objective, and I always entertain. Guys, please, if you're listening to this and you can help me with my timeline, if I got something wrong or I'm missing something, please let me know. Write me, email me, whatever. Miguel, thank you so much for having me on, man. This is a real milestone.
It's been wonderful. Yeah, and so much more in your book. Check it out, and hopefully we can get you back in the future and continue this and see what others are saying. But yeah, awesome. We are at the end.
Graham, you too, man. Graham, it was a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for pushing back, man. That was great. I appreciate that.
Oh, no, absolutely. It's just you and I agree on 90%, so there's only that little 10% area where I do.
Well, that's natural. I wouldn't expect, if you told me 100, it's like, all right, come on, Graham. Anyway.
Oh, I'm the type, I like it when people disagree with me, because then I can learn. I can learn where I'm wrong, because if I'm wrong, I want to correct it.
Yeah, it's like that saying, Graham. I forgot who said it. If you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Learning is how we get through this.
Could
Yeah.
not agree more.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we are at the end. Again, Michael, really enjoyed you coming here. Great work and fun conversation and a lot to think about. So, yeah, keep doing what you're doing. And likewise,
Thanks.
you too,
Thank
Graham. I know you've got your own. Graham has PowerPoints and writings and Reddit posts.
Yeah,
So, Graham
Graham, if
also has his
let's
stuff going.
connect. Let's connect afterwards. I'd love to see your stuff and what the rabbit holes you're going down. That'd be great.
Many rabbit holes.
I call it a rabbit warren. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Awesome.
Well, cool. For everybody else, yeah, really enjoyed you guys coming here to the virtual Alexandria. I see one super chat. Be done with it. Thanks for supporting this Red Pill
Right, be done.
Cafeteria. Yeah, please, as always, please support Aeon Biden any way you can. And tomorrow we will have at noon Central, Block Friday. David Block will join us. He's got He's got plenty of new research to show us as well. So, and then next week we'll have shows on the Goddess, different versions of the Goddess with some very cool guests. So, in the meantime, we are at the end of this rabbit hole, and I will end, as Michael said, with my infamous, famous, or scorned, or whatever tagline, but it works. Yes, write
It
your own
works.
gospel, live your own myth. Take care, everybody. Good night.